the US economy was incredibly fragile and heading for a global financial crisis, or at least for a US financial crisis before the pandemic. The pandemic was just a straw that broke the camel's back, and then the added incompetence in managing it turned it into a complete conflagration. By the way, the economic impact hasn't happened. I'm expecting it will hit somewhere between the second and third week of August. That's when shit hits the fan, economically speaking.
Hey everybody! Today we're welcoming back Andreas Antonopoulos, who needs no intro, but we'll give him one anyway. Andreas has made a name for himself speaking out against government authoritarianism and the dangers of centralization. He's most well known in the Bitcoin and crypto space, but today we'll be talking about a lot of other things. So just jumping right into it, Andreas, first of all, it's great to have you back.
Oh, thank you.
We're excited for this conversation.
It's good to be back on the show. I know last time we only had about half hour at the BitConf conference, and I promised you we'd do another one for more of a long form interview, which is more your style. So I'm glad to have this opportunity to do it.
Awesome. Yeah, we're super psyched that you were able to make it for this. So yeah, let's just jump right in. So where's your head at right now with regards to current events, the protests, the virus, and all this kind of stuff that's happening?
Oh boy. Yeah, it's really weird. Back in the beginning of February, actually more like the end of January, I think it was around the 25th of January that I decided that this was going to be a pandemic. And
a little earlier than some of us.
Started stocking up on provisions and buying things like masks and when you still could. And stuff like that. And by the first week of February, I started socially distancing, and everyone thought I was crazy, including my own relatives. I had a really hard time persuading family members to take this seriously. And they were like, well, you think we're going to have to take our kids out of school? I'm like, yeah. and keep them indoors and stay away from other people for what, weeks? I'm like, no, months. And they're like, I don't think that's going to happen. Okay, well, I hope you're right, but I do. So let's see how it plays out.
What made you think this pandemic was going to go global like that?
Well, seeing what was happening in Wuhan, seeing what extreme measures they had to take in order to contain the spread, told me that this was extremely virulent. And the fact that it had already broken out of that bubble, and we were already seeing cases in Italy and cases in Washington State and things like that, told me that there was no way this was going to get contained. And of course, hearing various so-called leaders trying to downplay it made me think that this was going to get worse, because people would be mollified into believing it wasn't serious, which means they take fewer precautions. And the way I look at it is, if people around you are behaving irresponsibly and taking fewer precautions, that just means you have to take more precautions to compensate. So, yeah, but also, I'm quite fortunate in that I work from home anyway. And I have a job that's independent of other people. It's a remote job. And so I was able to take precautions and start preparing for this without a significant impact on my life. I mean, an emotional impact, yes, but not, I wasn't in any hardship. I haven't been in any hardship other than an extrovert with extreme cabin fever at this point. But I have a job, I have income, I have food, I have a roof over my head. So from that perspective, I've been incredibly fortunate. And I was just not believing a lot of the stuff that I was hearing from people trying to downplay this.
Yeah, we actually we were all together in the house in Mexico in early March, and we were stockpiling and locking ourselves away kind of before it was cool. Also,
yeah.
You did it a bit earlier than us, but you might have been in a different place.
But maybe not by more than a week or two. And even so, I had to do it overcoming the incredulity and ridicule of everybody around me, because I don't know what it was like for you in Mexico at the time, but I'm assuming that around you, life continued as if nothing was happening, and people behaved as if nothing was happening out of the ordinary. Certainly in the US, it wasn't until mid-March that people started realizing, okay, this is happening.
Yeah, definitely that's what happened in Mexico. Like people continued about their normal lives for way after we were already sort of locked away.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm curious, when you were making your preparations, were you thinking primarily about safety from coronavirus and the virus itself, or were you thinking about the economy or how this might impact society once it hit?
Well, so I started actually preparing for an economic recession in the beginning of January. I rearranged a lot of my finances and built kind of a safety nest because I currently have 9 employees and contractors who depend on me for their income. So I really wanted to make sure that I was ready for economic disruption. So before I figured this was going to be a pandemic, I already thought, okay, this is already disrupting supply chains out of China, which is going to impact the tech sector primarily. And because the tech sector is such a big part of the American economy and consumer goods and things like that, as well as just, an underpinning of the cryptocurrency and blockchain industry, I figured we're in for a rough ride, regardless of whether it was a pandemic. Just China being as deeply affected was enough. I'm not of the prepper mentality, so I don't believe in guarding your beans with shotguns and preparing for defending my castle against hordes of zombies that are after my beans. I take the approach that in the case of a pandemic or a situation like that, the most important thing you can do is engage in your neighborhood, in your community, and help other people who haven't prepped as quickly as possible. So I stocked up not just for me, but stocked for assuming that I might need to share some of my provisions, medical supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, that in fact did happen. So when things got tight and the supermarkets emptied out, I was able to make sure that the people around me certainly had a bit extra.
Andreas, I'm curious, we've been having a lot of debate with our friends and discussion about whether this is aspects of the situation were in any way planned or orchestrated, or where the virus came from, whether it was created in a lab or whether it did emerge organically in these wet markets. I was wondering if you had any thoughts along those lines, or how your reflections have evolved there.
I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. Most of the stuff I've read about indications that it was created in a lab are not particularly persuasive. The fact that there is a bioresearch lab in Wuhan is hardly surprising, because Wuhan is the pharmaceutical industry and medical industry center of China. It's also where they make all the masks and all the gloves and all of the things we rely on. So it's not surprising they would also have the biomedical research labs there. To me, when trying to evaluate truths and issues like that, the most useful and I think important rule is Occam's razor, which is that in all likelihood, the simplest explanation is likely true. We already know that climate change and erosion of habitats and environmental shocks to biodiversity and urbanization, very, very difficult sanitation environments, dense urban living situations, the border wildlife environments, especially when those wildlife environments are brought into cities. All of those things are perfectly sufficient to explain the emergence of a novel coronavirus that is very infectious and has new lethality characteristics. And all of those things were predicted. Like, it's lots and lots of people said the next one's going to be a coronavirus and it's going to be a pandemic. So there's no need to go to a weapons lab, even if it was created in a lab. That argues for abolishing bioweapons research everywhere, because it doesn't matter whose lab it was created in and under what circumstances. The truth is that once one country does it, then other countries have to do it for defensive purposes, and then it becomes an arms race. There's a reason why we have treaties and conventions that ban these types of offensive weapons, because the game theory resolves with everybody trying to develop them. So it's important to stop everybody from developing them. And that's as far as I've gone with that thinking. It doesn't really matter where it came from, but the most likely explanation in my mind makes good enough sense.
Right, that makes sense. I have actually heard some reasonably compelling arguments that it might have come from the Wuhan lab, but I haven't looked into it enough to conclusively say one way or the other. But
that kind of thinking has caught on so much with so many thoughtful and intelligent people.
I think it has to do with a couple of things. The first one is the inability to emotionally process an invisible threat that has no obvious and cartoonishly evil cause. This thing is invisible, so you can't evaluate how risky it is. It could be anywhere, and that's terrifying in itself. And furthermore, to believe that such things can arise naturally means that it is a perpetual and increasing risk related to the structure of our society and the way we use natural resources. And that's something that can't easily be fixed simply by attacking Chinese people or going to war or things like that. It's a lot more comforting to have an explanation that has a cartoonish villain that is responsible and deliberate and malicious, rather than to think that human society is fragile. We live as one with nature, whether we like it or not. And when we piss all over nature, sometimes things emerge that try to eradicate us and have zero compassion for our elevated intellect and sensibility, right? Oh, lung receptors, yummy! And they just go for it. And that kind of senseless violence from an invisible threat that is only interested in you because you have fertile lung tissue is much scarier than to think that other evil people who either weren't being hygienic enough or were eating weird things and therefore deserve this, or were experimenting with evil weapons in order to kill us all. That's more comforting because you can understand that. I think that's why it's taken hold. It's very dangerous, though. That kind of conspiracy thinking, first of all, it serves to obscure the real reasons behind very real global problems that we continue to ignore at our peril. And it leads to the kind of xenophobic, militaristic response to crises that are entirely of our own making.
Right. Yeah. So we definitely wanted to get to the the xenophobic and militaristic response. One of the things we were most interested in for this discussion was your thoughts on the government's reaction.
I mean, well, first of all, I assume you're talking about the U.S. government, but one of the interesting things is that a pandemic or any kind of phenomenon like that, a global disaster like this, basically shines a spotlight on every system that is fragile. And among other things, it shines a spotlight on our ability to govern risk as a society in a way that achieves optimal outcomes. And, as a geek, my desire would be that we approach this from a perspective of clear-headed science with both an attempt to understand the truth, but also to account for mistakes in our scientific analysis when things are moving very fast and we have incomplete information, and have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D just in case, we got the R naught wrong, or the case fatality rate wrong, and it's worse or better than we expected. That's what I would expect. Is that what happened? No. So, as someone who is interested in science, the result was rather predictable, but it became an ideological battle, and I think a lot of people politicize this in a way, making it about choosing sides in a culture war that I am so tired of fighting, and that, in the end, is responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of people who would otherwise be alive today in the US and across the world. Because it didn't just happen in the US. I mean, it happened in the US, but the same kind of bullheaded political bungling incompetence happened in the UK, it happened in the Philippines, it happened in Turkey, it's happening in Brazil at the moment. So it's not just, Trump. It's more that kind of attitude towards governance that is anti-science and distrustful of scientific consensus that underlies our approach to other policy issues like climate change. And it's the same kind of attitude you see from Duterte in the Philippines, from Bolsonaro in Brazil, from Erdogan in Turkey, from and from Boris Johnson in the UK. So this was a test of leadership, and several government leaders failed it miserably.
Right. It sounds like you're critical of both governments that overreacted and governments that underreacted, because I believe the UK basically was pretty slow.
The UK, no, I mean, all of the governments, I think, that I mentioned underreacted or went into complete denial. And by the way, this is a normal response. I think it's a normal human response, not only to protect from the horror of this pandemic with denial, but also to have normalcy bias as a cognitive bias that wants desperately to believe that things are normal or can return to normal, and that this all either isn't happening or isn't as bad or will pass quickly. That's a normal human reaction. However, we have institutions of governance so that we don't, as a society as a whole, fall prey to biases and irrational thinking by creating checks and balances and mechanisms for decision making and oversight and accountability, and organizations that specialize and have scientific expertise. All of those things are there to prevent us from falling prey to our base emotions and immediate reactions, and to give us better outcomes. Well, all of those things failed, or rather were already failing, and the pandemic revealed the level of failure and fragility that existed in those systems. So it was a failure of governance. It's not unlike, and I see many similarities in the arguments and discussions we have around crypto versus traditional financial systems, right? This is institutional failure on a large scale that happens in banking that needs to be fixed by better decentralized systems and governance. And now we had institutional failure in governance and healthcare and a whole bunch of other things since.
I'm kind of curious, because you seem to be saying that governments failed to react strongly enough, and saying that they failed to follow scientific consensus. But from my perception, and I think many others, the scientific consensus has changed quite a bit.
Yes.
we were presented with death rates upwards of 5 and 10%, and now we're looking at death rates of maybe 0.2 to 0.3%, according to the CDC. Maybe that's not actually what it is, but how are people or governments supposed to react rationally and with scientific consensus when there is no clear thing that we're supposed to be reacting to?
Well, I think you have the best case scenario and the worst case scenario, and you try to find ways to accommodate both. I think the death rates actually in the U.S. are in excess of 5%. It depends on whether you believe there's a lot of transmission that has occurred that has gone unseen, and people have, and we won't know that until we have solid antibody tests. But part of the failure there was failure to test and contain early, which then necessitated an overreaction later when it started getting to the point where it was spreading out of control. And also failures from scientific bodies like the WHO and the CDC, who both said you don't need masks, which turned out to be terrible advice, which I completely ignored, and wore masks in public since the beginning of February, which actually worked really well, because when you're the lone idiot wearing a mask in a supermarket, you get bonus social distancing because no one will enter the aisle with you because they think you're crazy. So double bonus there.
A bank robber or something.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the initial reaction was underreaction, which led to the subsequent reaction had to be overreaction, because otherwise we would very much be looking at more than 1 million dead, I think, in the US, and possibly more than 100 million dead worldwide. Even with complete social isolation, we got a range of fatalities that was considered completely unexpected at first. That's my opinion. But
yeah, that's interesting. Well, I guess I see you as kind of a more small government guy, and I guess a lot of my friends that I've talked to who are small government people have said things like, "Oh, well, the government is overreacting. Why are they shutting down all these services? Why are they basically they've been saying that the government has been overreacting since the beginning." I guess I'm wondering what your picture of like the appropriate government response would have been. Something like at first, because we didn't know what we were dealing with, maybe kind of proceed cautiously and try to collect as much data as possible, and then as it became clear that it was much more serious, maybe start suspending certain activities and start requiring people to wear masks and things like that.
Well, I think if people were simply advised and then shown through leadership that it is sensible to wear masks, not just to protect yourself, which is less effective, more to protect others from yourself, and it's most effective when both parties in an engagement are wearing masks, and making it a cultural norm and saying, look, for the next few months, we're all going to wear masks and we're all going to be very careful with what we touch, et cetera, we wouldn't have gotten to this situation.
So you think,
and
maybe
in countries where they did that, the results have been absolutely different than, for example, the US or Brazil or places like that.
Which countries? Could you give an example?
I mean, to pick one where Japan, for one thing, but also Vietnam, which is a surprising country that normally you would think of as politically dysfunctional, and they had a very heavy-handed approach, but they also tested, contained, and quarantined anybody who showed symptoms very, very quickly, and as a result, they didn't get, I think they literally have like 2-digit deaths, maybe like 60 people.
Yeah.
And they returned to normal within a month.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that like an early masking and quarantining the sick response back in February or early March would have been like better if countries had had the foresight to do that. But like in countries that are in a situation where the virus is spreading, I do want to question a little bit, like the cost benefit analysis. Like, it seems to me there's like a trolley problem between like letting more people die from coronavirus versus some of the stimulus programs and economic damage that have happened in these countries that have taken a like hard lockdown approach seem pretty devastating to me. Like, I don't know, I was just pulling up some numbers. Like in New York City, they've done antibody tests, and about 20% of people in Manhattan test positive for COVID antibodies, coronavirus antibodies. So, but like if you run the numbers with the death rate, that suggests like a death rate percentage kind of in line with what Katie was saying, like under 1%, like in the 0.2 to 0.5% range.
Yeah,
So
I wanted to push back on that too. The CDC has models out now where the number that they're using is also between 0.3 and 0.5%.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not clear to me. Like, just
average across all ages.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, and the problem was, among other things, that our hospital infrastructure and the for-profit healthcare system and the lack of sick pays and all of these other structural systems made it so that our healthcare system was simply unable to cope. If we had service workers out there going to work sick without masks, we'd forget grandparents for a generation. Like, bye-bye grandparents. Their death rate would have been in excess of 10%. And in some places, it was. So, and again, yeah, I mean, we can have, I think this argument won't be resolved for years, in that, first of all, the antibody tests, I don't think we have like good accuracy yet, but more broadly, we're going to have to go back and look at this kind of like a forensic analysis, post-mortem analysis of everything that happened, and then figure it out. And this is going to be a field of study for decades, for sure. And we'll find out if countries overreacted or not. Although, to tell you the truth, the lockdowns, at least from the perspective that I saw here in the US, in most of the places where they instituted lockdowns, the lockdowns were a foregone conclusion, primarily because people simply stopped going out because they didn't believe that that they could protect themselves, and they couldn't because the government wasn't testing. So if every encounter you had in every public place was playing roulette with the health of you and your elderly relatives, a lot of people simply weren't willing to take that risk. So in practice, restaurant, bars, and service industry shut down before the government orders, and after the government orders lapsed, they didn't open for a while in places that were badly affected. It wasn't the government telling people to shut down. It was people deciding on their own not to expose themselves and their relatives to that kind of risk. And by the way, I think we're heading for a second wave probably by mid-July to end July. And we're going to have to play this game again. And primarily because people are not, again, taking the precautions. And the additional 3 months that the government has had have again been wasted. So we still don't have testing, and we still don't have masks or any of the other guidance, leadership, anything to deal with this.
Right. So it sounds like your sort of ideal government response would have been like, okay, everybody, it looks like this virus might be pretty bad. Let's all start wearing masks. Let's all start wearing masks. Let's all start, avoiding large gatherings. But it does seem also that you were in favor of kind of the heavy-handed approach, where the government came in and said, okay, everybody, we're gonna force you to stop, gathering in large numbers, and we're gonna force you to, we're gonna basically fine you for not wearing a mask and things like that.
Well, first of all, I haven't seen too many places fine for not wearing a mask. Certainly that's not happening in the US. And even in places very heavily affected, like New York or Michigan, people are still going out and flaunting the fact that they won't wear masks, calling anyone who's wearing a mask a pussy, coughing and spitting in other people's faces, doing performative risk-taking for political purposes. So I wouldn't say we've had too much heavy-handed. Obviously, the heavy-handed thing is basically forcing employers to close their businesses.
Yeah,
That
definitely.
are non-essential, and that was very heavy-handed. And I don't think it would have been necessary unless all of the other interim things failed. But given the catastrophe that happened in the hospital system, and I did see it firsthand here.
You went to a hospital where they were like overloaded?
Yeah, and I have friends who worked in those hospitals
Wow.
as doctors and nurses during this crisis in the areas that were very heavily affected. It was mayhem. So when it reaches that point, yeah, I mean, listen, if government has any role to play, libertarians will probably say it's the common defense, so military, and a justice system. And, when it comes to public health in a pandemic, I think that is a rational and appropriate role for government, because if people are endangering others through their behavior, then I think that's a valid purpose for government, especially if it's temporary. And the idea that you can handle this, I mean, I've talked about this a few other times, but how do you interpret the non-aggression principle when breathing viral load on someone is aggression?
Yeah, I've made that
And
exact
you are
argument.
refusing to wear a mask voluntarily. So I mean, that's as they say, that your right to extend your fist stops in front of my nose. Most societies have an even narrow definition of that, which means that as you start extending your fist towards my nose, it's already assault. When it touches my nose, it's battery. And breathing without a mask during a pandemic is, in my opinion, is unacceptable aggression. Yeah, I don't think you can handle that within a voluntarist framework.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I have a lot of friends who are kind of on the voluntarist side, and they seem to be like, no, masks are stupid. And I tried to make that exact argument, and I'm having mixed success. So, Ariel, did you want to?
Yeah. It almost sounds like you're making like you're suggesting that maybe some people who are kind of blaming this on government are having like a big bad moment again, or they want to blame it on a big bad guy, when really it's more the emergent result of the pandemic itself, like a lot of the devastation to the economy and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and again, blaming the economic result on the pandemic is also, I think, a convenient scapegoat. We've been talking for more than a decade, about the fact that the economic system is extremely fragile, about the fact that all of the problems that were revealed in 2008 weren't fixed, about the fact that we were heading back into a global financial crisis again, and that it was imminent, and that various systems were beginning to flash red long before the pandemic. Just look at what was happening in the overnight repo markets in October. There was no hint of a pandemic then. So to simply say, oh, the economic impact was horrific, but it was because of the pandemic. No, it wasn't. The entire system was fragile. And it was a system that happened to have fragilities in areas that were particularly exposed to the specific scenario of a pandemic. If you have a country that has, for example, I'm talking about the US again, but if you have a country that has the majority of its economy based on a service sector, the vast majority of the middle class working in service jobs, those jobs being low paid, no benefit, no healthcare, no sick leave, have no framework for sick leave, have no framework for unemployment, have no framework for healthcare, and take no action to give people the opportunity to take tests. What that means is that sick people will go to work because they don't have a choice. And so you've created all of the circumstances for super spreader events. The US economy was incredibly fragile and heading for a global financial crisis or for, at least for a U.S. financial crisis before the pandemic. The pandemic was just a straw that broke the camel's back, and then the added incompetence in managing it turned it into a complete conflagration. By the way, the economic impact hasn't happened. It will hit about, I'm expecting it will hit somewhere between the second and third week of August. That's when shit hits the fan, economically speaking. They've managed to postpone it with just obscene amount of money printing, but unemployment runs out, rent and mortgage forgiveness and postponement, eviction pauses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things run out somewhere between July 15th and August 1st. And so around the end of August, we should be seeing the full economic impact of this. So it's going to be really ugly.
So I guess you're predicting that the government is not going to continue printing obscene amounts of money to try and stave off the disaster even longer.
I mean, I think they're going to try, but if they continue doing it in the way they've done it before, which is trickle down and really, really pushing the Cantillon Effect, the ability for those who already have positions of power, positions of wealth, to maximally take advantage of these things while making it almost impossible for the people at the bottom of the economic system to use even the meager breadcrumbs that are thrown their way. Yes, even if there is more stimulus, it's still going to go primarily into blowing up income inequality, and it's not going to help. It's not going to help the people at the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that because of all of this money printing that's been going on, do you think that this could be Bitcoin's moment where finally people realize that fiat currency is not actually a good store of value and start buying Bitcoin, and maybe it reaches mass adoption?
I don't know. I'm not entirely optimistic about that. For one thing, because I think that this economic recession is incredibly deflationary because of the collapse in demand. And so as a result, it's unlikely to result in monetary inflation. What it is going to result in is asset inflation primarily. So ridiculous stock valuations, ridiculous increases in real estate, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not actually going to change the purchasing power of basic staples for the middle class. They're going to be broke for other reasons, but not because their dollar doesn't go as far. So I don't think we're going to see much monetary inflation, at least at first. I think what we're going to see is a deflationary stagnation environment that may suddenly change into an inflationary stagnation environment. But then again, I'm not an economist. I don't know that this is Bitcoin's moment to shine. I think this is Bitcoin's moment to provide an additional choice and a way for people to diversify. But it is certainly a moment for fiat to stink, and for banking to show its weakness. Here's another example. What happened in the US, among other things, was this kind of backdoor bailout of the banks by giving all of these stimulus programs like the Paycheck Protection Program or the Small Business Administration Program. All of those were basically managed through the banks. The distribution was managed through the banks, where they got the opportunity to make loans or extend money at 3% while getting it at 0% on the back end, and then have those loans underwritten, guaranteed, and bought back by the government, so zero risk. Well, that was effectively a backdoor stimulus program that is worth somewhere between $500 and $750 billion. And it benefited the banks tremendously. Same thing happened with the extension of Treasury purchasing and Fed purchasing of distressed corporate bonds, which effectively meant that none of the big companies needed to go and ask for a bailout, because what they could do is simply go into the bond market, get very, very low interests, and then have the Fed gobble up those bonds. So they got 0% loans from the government through the back door. And again, all of these massively stimulative programs, they bailed up these giant corporations at the expense of workers, but they don't lead immediately to inflation. So I don't know. I mean, I think all they do is they really emphasize how broken the banking system is. Now, if that makes you want to buy more Bitcoin, good.
Right.
Makes me want to buy more Bitcoin.
I think more importantly, it makes you want to use Bitcoin, hopefully, not just buy it.
I think it makes at least us want to buy more Bitcoin. But one thing that I've noticed is in the recent protests about George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests, there's been a lot of anti-capitalist imagery, anarchy symbols of the leftist-oriented type. And then we're seeing trends in other countries like Spain implementing a permanent UBI. I personally, I think it's more likely that this might lead us into kind of more of a socialist trend, because I mean, if people can't work, and governments are supposed to intervene, what else can you really do? Is that something that you see coming, or what do you think of those trends that are happening now?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that this pandemic revealed was the inherent problems of the kind of bullshit capitalism we have in most of the West, which is a mixture of crony capitalism, kleptocracy, and socialism, socialism for large corporations. So it's like all losses are socialized, all profits are privatized, unless you're at the lower end of the rungs of the ladder, in which case you get rugged individualist bootstrapping capitalism. But if you're a shareholder, that would be too harsh. So I think the problem here is that kind of really corrupt crony capitalism, which we can have a whole other show about whether that is a natural outcome of capitalism or not. And there'll be all kinds of, I think there's a lot of arguments about no true Scotsman, or, this isn't real capitalism, and real capitalism would be much better, which is the same thing you hear about socialism in former communist states. But the bottom line is that people got to see how weak and fragile a system like that is, and how easily it discards a very large number of people. And that creates a backlash. Now, that backlash isn't going to turn into policy. I don't think we're going to see socialism emerge in the United States anytime soon. In fact, if anything, we're seeing far more fascist tendencies, because the authoritarianism in the US tends to be much more nationalistic and capitalistic in its underlying messaging. So it tends to go towards more fascist tendencies rather than more socialist totalitarianism. But it's still authoritarianism. I don't care. It's both bad.
Yeah, definitely agree there.
I guess I kind of want to challenge that a little bit, because with all the protests I'm seeing in the U.S., we're seeing massive leftist and many cases very socialist or insurrectionary protests in large U.S. cities, even in smaller U.S. cities and towns all across the country. And I'm curious. As for me, when I look at that, I'm not convinced that the right wing brand. It seems that there is a strong left wing brand of, I don't know if you want to call it authoritarianism, but at the very least radicalism. I wonder how that kind of fits into your.
Yes, absolutely. But how much power does that have? In practice, not much at all. The American system is designed to be quite conservative and slow to change. Architecturally, it resists rapid change. And what the political system is dominated by these very, very large power structures that favor an older demographic, a whiter demographic, a more affluent demographic, and a more rural demographic. That's not going to change anytime soon. And the system is designed to prevent it from changing too fast. So, a lot of flags in the streets and a lot of snappy slogans and autonomous zones in Seattle don't make for a change in the political system. So I think part of the frustration, here's the irony of all this. When for the past 20 years, anything even remotely populist that comes from the progressive political wing in this country is automatically branded socialism, what that does in the minds of conservatives is it condemns those policies. In the minds of anybody who's not a conservative, however, what it does is it glamorizes socialism. So when you say, okay, free education or free healthcare or single-payer healthcare, that's socialism. Sick leave, that's socialism. Regulations on businesses, that's socialism. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you keep going and you just simply brand everything as socialism. So for a younger generation that hasn't had any experience of real socialism, right, and who see that there's plenty of European countries that have this kind of soft socialism of a welfare state and a different approach to the justice system, a different approach to policing, a different approach to unemployment and maternity leave and healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. If you keep branding all of these things socialist, eventually a whole generation of people go, I kind of want some of that socialism you've been telling me is so bad. Because all of the things that I think that, first of all of the things that my parents and my grandparents actually had, meaning the ability to support a decent middle-class lifestyle on a single job and get a college education that are completely out of the reach of every young person today. You just told me those are socialism. Well, I'd like some of that. It worked really well for my parents and my grandparents. And so what's happened is, ironically, I think, a certain type of reactionary conservative politics has actually managed to glamorize the word socialism instead of by overusing it to demonize everything that might give a younger generation a chance to survive, and creating a brutal environment for the younger generation. And I think that's backfired badly. So of course you get people flying the flag now because they've been told their entire life that that's what socialism is.
I don't know. I mean, I think there is a lot of truth to that, but here's another element that I kind of see on the radical left is it's not just that, they want the free education and the free healthcare in a state that's more socialist, like the states in Europe, or it wasn't real socialism. Like there's a real push towards like leftist anarchism, towards like bringing down the state entirely and setting up like that's what the CHAZ in Seattle. It's all based on a philosophy of, we don't need the civilization is evil. Its trappings are evil. We don't want to live in the, metropolitan zone anymore. Like we want to be self-sufficient and small and like, screw you society. Like,
yeah, but that's a really fringe, that's a really, really fringe ideology. And at the same time, again, I think that is the result of a feeling of disempowerment, disenfranchisement, and abandonment by a system that isn't working for a lot of people. And so, yeah, when you have a system that consistently creates unbearable living conditions for a big chunk of the population, eventually they've had enough and they go burn the whole thing down. And there's no nuance. Nuance is lost, right, at that point.
Right.
And that's classic reactionary politics, and it's the result of not giving an avenue for the redress of grievances. And I think that's a real problem. Like, the reason we're having that today is partly because of the way the Occupy Wall Street protests were handled in the previous crisis, right? So if there's no possibility of reform, if there's no possibility of redress of grievances, if there's no possibility of any change to the system, when you close off all of those peaceful avenues, then the only thing that's left is radicalism, and that's what we're seeing now.
Yeah,
That
I mean,
doesn't mean it wins.
I think what you're saying is actually compatible with one another, because I mean, Andreas, you're saying that basically we've glamorized socialism. Ariel, you're saying that there seems to be a growing radical leftist element to the U.S. I mean, it seems to me like if the political discourse in the U.S. is glamorizing socialism by making things like universal health care and affordable college socialism, that might lead some young people to Google socialism and find actual socialism, or, you know, philosophical socialism, which is very, very, very
right,
hard.
rather than the practical reality of the reality of socialism, of course, is the same bullshit crony socialism that I grew up with in Eastern Europe, that meant that everything was dysfunctional and everything required a bribe and you couldn't make any progress and all of the rules were stacked against you. It's the exact same system we have in the US today. The only difference is some of the language used, but in its practical effects, crony capitalism and crony socialism don't differ that much. But here's the thing. I've been in the US now for 20 years, and what I can tell you is that the Overton window of political discourse in the US simply did not allow the expression of any things that would be considered center-left, for example, in Europe. So the window of discussion has shifted so far to the right that center-left policies are inconceivable. What passes for a left party in the US would be considered a center-right Christian Democrat party in Europe. Being pro-war, pro-corporations, pro-big banks, and resistant to any kind of reform of police, healthcare, education, et cetera, that's not leftist. And so if you cut off the conversation and you don't give breathing room for that conversation, what you end up getting is radicalism. And that's what we have. So I'm not surprised by it. I also don't think it's going to change anything, unfortunately.
Andreas, I'm a little bit curious, like whether you're in support of like institutions like public education, public healthcare. I'm legitimately confused about where you stand on some of these. Like, where do you stand on those countries in, Sweden, and I'm Canadian, and Canada?
So I got an education that I paid for, but I paid for at a ridiculously low cost by going to the University of London in the 1990s. So I benefited from a public education system that gave me a college education, a very high quality Ivy League college education, for effectively less than $3,000 a year of tuition.
Oh, wow. Was that from the university or from the British government, or
from the British government? That's what the system was structured like. So I think the system that exists in the US that requires someone to get $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $100,000 in debt in order to graduate from college is absurd. And all of the structure around that, of making that debt impossible to discharge and making it possible for banks and other organizations to extend those loans with zero risk because they're underwritten by the government. It's kind of the worst possible combination of the constraints of rugged individualist capitalism for the students and corporate socialism for the banks that extend those loans so that they don't have to take risks. It's the worst of both systems. And the same thing applies to healthcare. It's the worst of both systems. You don't actually have price transparency, working markets, choice of care, but you also don't have any kind of support so that if you're unlucky enough to have a disease, you die. I have used the healthcare system in Europe, including in the United Kingdom under the National Health Service, and also in the US, and for serious things, not just trivial things. And the US system is broken. It's completely broken. So I don't believe in public delivery of healthcare because that tends to create its own problems. But at the same time, I do believe more in a single payer or some kind of universal healthcare, at least for basic wellness and health. I do. And so I don't think people should be just left to die if they can't afford treatment. So, and that's something I'm happy to pay taxes for. And in fact, that's one of the few things that I'm happy to pay taxes for. I would like to see the entire Department of Defense $1 trillion budget just shifted into health and education, at which point we need to do a lot less law order, war, and punishment. But it's not just a straightforward public healthcare and public education for everyone, unlimited at whatever cost, paid for by the taxpayers. That creates its own problems. Right. There's a nuanced, I think, situation in between, and I think also the situation we have in the U.S. today is simply the worst of both worlds.
Right. I mean, definitely when you start publicly funding healthcare and education, the government can screw up those industries just as much as it can possibly fix them. So it sounds like you're advocating for more government spending, like where appropriate, but basically that would require essentially smarter government rather than necessarily larger government. Well,
but also the system we have today isn't really a free market system. So, there isn't any competition in healthcare, and there isn't any competition in pharmaceuticals, and there isn't. So the system is rigged as it is already.
Are you just talking about all of the regulations that kind of make it hard?
The intellectual property mechanisms that allow a company to sit on insulin patents that are basically fraudulent and extract ridiculous prices out of something that the inventor of insulin made purposely for free to help the world. Those are classic regulatory capture problems.
Right.
And there's broader and bigger problems than that. I'm not saying I have any solutions. I just don't think any of this is black and white. But I do think it's very broken as it is right now.
Yeah. So speaking of all this, the U.S. does have elections coming up in November, which are hardly on the public radar at all. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on what might happen, like if you have thoughts on who might win, but also what the consequences of that might be given the instability that the U.S. is facing right now.
Oh boy. What a mess.
Yeah.
So, the system of democracy in the U.S. is just as severely broken as many of the other institutions, between gerrymandering and various forms of disenfranchisement and all of the barriers to voting. There's a lot of problems with the elections as they are. I don't really know. I think it is horrifying to imagine that Trump might get reelected, although it's possible. if enough people are disenfranchised and prevented from voting, it is possible that Trump could get reelected with, once again, like massively losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College. And I think that would be a disaster. Or instead, we could get the other senile rapist as president. I mean,
Right.
it's a really shitty choice, and it's as much the fault of Democrats as it is of Republicans. I mean, both parties have basically abdicated any responsibility of governing, or and they're all compromised in terms of their policies.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the choice is so bad that we're hardly even talking about it right now. Like, you would think that after Trump, like with how devastating his presidency has been for so many people in the country, that everyone would be really thrilled about the possibility of getting rid of him. But Joe Biden's got to be one of the least popular candidates in history.
Well, yeah,
and it's arguable that his presidency has been devastating for a huge portion of the country.
At least he
definitely still has his base.
At least emotionally devastating for a huge portion of the country. I think it's been devastating to like morale of the citizenry.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is I think it's been devastating to the people who didn't vote for him. But I think the people who did vote for him are pretty happy.
Yeah.
No, I know a lot of people who have gotten very severe cases of Trump-gret from their vote. And most of them are serious, principled conservatives who see him for what he is, and
but they didn't see that before they voted for him.
I think for a lot of them, they kind of triangulated into a position where they thought that, despite the fact that he was an insincere, insecure, hypocritical con man, that he would be managed by the adults in the room, and he would at least deliver on some important single issue topics that they really, really cared about. And they were also either terrified or repulsed by Hillary Clinton as the alternative option, which again is entirely the Democrats' fault.
Understandably.
Yeah, I mean that position is kind of right. Like, he is all those things, and he has delivered on a lot of key policies for.
Yes, absolutely. At some point, the reason people get regrets is because they're now beginning to see that stacking the courts and delivering tax cuts isn't worth the cost that he's extracted from the political system, the institutions of democracy, the standing of the country, and the death toll and damage done after all. So I think that's why they get regrets. They were hoping that it would be worth it, and it wasn't. I think there are a lot of principled conservatives who long ago abandoned that, and there are a lot who were screaming from the very beginning that, what makes you think that a thrice married New York real estate con man is a symbol of conservatism or anything other than, daddy issues. So, but then again, it took the Democrats nominating a centrist Republican, Clinton, to lose that election. If they had nominated someone who appealed to the progressive and moderate Democrats in a way that encouraged and engaged the youth vote to come out, they wouldn't have lost the election.
Yeah.
And they've done it again. So the problem has to do more with, I'm going to say it, it has to do with boomers. The problem has to do with the inordinate amount of power, privilege, and comfort that boomers have and continue to demand, and they're doing it at the expense of the next generation. And the next generation simply doesn't have the cohesive organization, narrative and voting power to unseat them yet.
Right.
But their reckoning is coming.
I definitely agree that the boomers need to probably give up power sooner rather than later. And I see these protests and these riots as kind of a maybe sort of a millennial / Generation Z uprising. It does seem to me that if as you predict, sometime in August, all of the benefits run out and the economy really takes a hit, then the protests might get worse. And then say Trump wins the election in November, then the protests might get worse. I mean, like I'm picturing like we could have a civil war or something. I mean, if all of that stuff goes, just by a roll of the dice, just doesn't go the right way.
I don't think it goes that far, but there certainly could be much more extreme and violent outcomes. I think people forget what 1968 was like. But the country did come to the brink of that kind of breakdown of civil society for many of the same reasons, in fact. And a lot of those things are not really resolved. The U.S. is perpetually fighting the first Civil War and is still mired in some of the same problems from that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we have basically skeletons in our closet from the beginning of the country, mostly having to do with racism and slavery
and not having those thoroughly resolved and put aside creates long-term problems. It's ironic, for example, that the country that fights strongest against fascism and racism today is Germany, because they had such a thorough and deep reckoning, and they transformed their educational system to make sure that none of it would be forgotten. Whereas, America really hasn't done that. And
I mean, are you kind of suggesting that the U.S. would have to go through some kind of transition like Germany did in order to finally deal with its race problems?
Well, transition meaning truth, reconciliation, and education, not violent revolution or war or destruction. But if we don't address these issues and we don't talk about them, and it's not polite to talk about these things at the dinner table, what that means is that your racist uncle who continues to vote continues to think it's okay to perpetuate these problems. So, because that's not a conversation we have at the dinner table. Well, if we don't have it at the dinner table, then we have it at the ballot box, and then soon thereafter we have it on the street corner or behind barricades. That's the problem. We should have it at the dinner table.
Right. Yeah, interesting.
I'm curious if you could unpack a bit this idea of truth, justice, and reconciliation. Like what do you think needs to happen to address some of these, this mounting racial tension in the U.S.? Like you mentioned conversation, but like maybe on a policy level.
I mean, I don't know. I've only lived in this country for 20 years, which may be a lot, but at the same time, it's a very short period of time. So I don't have the deep cultural background and history. All that I know is that there seems to be a lot of whitewashing of history, pun intended, that serves to perpetuate problems because these things are simply not discussed. So I've seen history textbooks, and well, let's say that they seemed very different when I learned about those things in my school in Greece. And keep in mind, I'm not saying that Greece has its own unexamined history that it glosses over, right? Every country does that.
Yeah, very true.
But in countries where you have like deep-seated wounds like that, it simply serves to perpetuate those wounds. Yeah, but maybe things are changing. Maybe things are changing. I'm seeing cops being prosecuted for murder, and NASCAR prohibiting Confederate flags. So
yeah, So I actually did want to ask you about, since this conversation has been kind of dark for most of it, like what are you hopeful about? How do you see the future unfolding in a positive way? And do you think that's likely?
So what I'm hopeful about is the fact that moments of crisis, they both reveal deep-seated problems, but they also have within them the seeds of change, because they create discontinuity with the past, where things that were previously thought impossible become possible simply because there's no alternative. And so people are forced to reconcile their preconceptions. They're forced to address cognitive dissonance. They're forced to pay attention. A lot of people being out of work and having more time on their hands has actually changed the way this conversation about race has happened since last time. It happens every few years, and this time seems to be slightly different. And I think that has a lot to do with the context. And that makes me hopeful because, we have a young, empowered generation that have the greatest narrative engine ever built, which is the internet. And they're using that to change society's narratives and to create new narratives and to discuss ideas. And so out of that, there's bound to be some change in how we deal with things. And that's probably good. I think, in December, if you asked me, where do you think things are going? I would have said, well, I think we're going to muddle along and keep postponing the financial recession. Trump's going to get a second term. Everything's going to remain kind of meh for years and years and years, and we're just going to see the steady decline of empire play out in slow motion. Not anymore, because nothing stops the steady decline of empire in slow motion than a crash. So suddenly it went from slow motion to freeze frame, and a lot of people had to change their behavior. And once you change your behavior, then you start believing that change is possible. That makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that people can have conversations they were afraid to have before because they have more to lose or less to lose, depending on the circumstances. And out of that, we get a peaceful cultural reform and change that is needed in every society every now and then to freshen things up. Because the alternative, if you just keep tamping that down, is a not so peaceful change later. Is that optimistic enough?
Yeah, that's pretty optimistic.
Like
that's if we survive the second wave of coronavirus.
Right. It's been really interesting throughout this conversation because, I and others generally know you in like the cryptocurrency context, talking about decentralization, fighting against authoritarianism with privacy tools, things of that nature. But what I've heard from you throughout this, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to, but it like you're kind of almost sounding like a progressive or a Democrat and not speaking much to some of the authoritarian trends that we're seeing.
No, not at all. I would disagree with that.
Okay.
Assessment.
Yeah.
But,
yeah, I think I'm getting it wrong. I'm just trying to express that I feel kind of confused.
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't think any label can encompass somebody's worldview in total. What I'm seeing is the failure of institutional and hierarchical systems. I think a lot of the solutions involve decentralized solutions, but I can't ignore the fact that while we're building decentralized solutions and I'm looking to adopt and use decentralized solutions in my own life, there is a power struggle going on within the centralized institutions, and that power struggle is happening. Pretending it's not going to happen or it's not happening isn't very useful. And I do think it's important to point out when the centralized institutions are failing us in ways that are novel and creative, not just through their traditional centralized institutions. I mean, the U.S. has had con artists in the position of president before. But I don't think we've seen an example as extreme as Donald Trump in recent history. And this is pretty extreme stuff. It's not, I'm not going to pretend to normalize that. That has nothing to do with being a Democrat or progressive or anything like that. I despise the Democrats. They're spineless and have no real political position, and, you know, are too busy serving the same corporate and war industry interests as Republicans. So I'm certainly not a Democrat. Actually, you know, probably the one person who has spoken to my political opinions the most during this entire thing has been Justin Amash.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
Did we lose Andreas? The government is censoring him for mentioning Justin Amash.
Maybe let's ask if he's able to.
Oh, here. He looks like we lost you there for a minute.
hey.
Welcome back.
Hey.
Okay, the fact that this happened just after Katie called me a Democrat is purely a coincidence.
I'm so sorry. I didn't. Okay.
No, I'm joking.
Okay. I wasn't meaning
was-
to
it was-
call you.
Katie calls everybody Democrats.
I was like, he said Justin Amash, and the government must have just said, okay,
Yeah,
he's
that's
done.
it. End of conversation.
We
Yeah,
supported this conversation up until this point. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know who Justin Amash is, but
No.
Yeah.
The Libertarian congressman.
well, he's now a Libertarian congressman. He was a Republican congressman from Michigan until maybe a few months ago, and then he had it with Trump and the Republican Party, and quit and became a Libertarian, or declared himself an independent. But he's a principled conservative, and I very much respect his opinions. You know, I don't look at these things from a partisan perspective. There are certain aspects of my worldview that are very progressive. I won't disagree with that. I believe in change. I believe in renewal and progress. So from that perspective, those things, as any kind of geek techno utopian, I do have some progressive tendencies. I'm mostly concentrated in, you know, using technology to make a better world. And those are by definition not conservative positions. I don't believe in preserving the past. I believe in progressing to a future. And there are other aspects that in my worldview that are quite conservative. I'm not going to use the trite enlightened centrism slogan, which is I'm economically conservative and socially liberal, because I think that's mostly bullshit, because you can't separate economics from society. And so those don't quite make sense. That just kind of means I don't really understand any of this, and I don't want to take a position for fear of offending everyone.
I think
Andreas,
I'll offend everyone, probably on this very video.
Awesome.
So I did want to say you do seem very, very difficult to pin down politically. You do seem to basically every time we suggest like, oh, you might be this label, you're like, no, I'm not that label. And I think probably like most of us, you eschew labels, and you basically you have a unique stance on every issue instead of just being on team red or team blue.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm certainly not on any specific team, and I didn't even grow up in this country to have any of those labels as defined by kind of American political discourse. The bottom line is I'm interested in politics, I'm interested in governance, in architecture, in society, in psychology, and sociology, and I read a lot on all of those subjects. And out of that doesn't come, you know, strong certainty, strong opinions held firmly, and simple answers. What comes out of that is an impossibly complex, chaotic mass of gray. There are obviously some strong principles I stand for, and you know, I think I mentioned that before. Justice is very important to me, and fairness is very important to me, but I try to operate from those first principles that are important to me, but the answers I get are not simple. And I think the reason for that is because the problems are not simple. Humans are infuriatingly irrational and complex, and the societies we build are also infuriatingly irrational and complex. So I am very skeptical and distrustful of simple answers and simple solutions. And so if you ask me about my political opinions and you try to pin me down, most of my answers are going to start with, well, it depends. And I find that that's how you have interesting conversations. So if you could just stick a label on it, then that's the end of the conversation.
Yeah, and it's cool. It's like I find this really like refreshing that we're having this conversation, and like, sometimes you talk to people and like their opinions are all kind of stacking along a particular like ideological like platform, and I'm appreciating this feeling of confusion that I'm experiencing talking to you.
I'm equally confused about my own opinions, and I, as I said, I have strong opinions based on strong principles, but I hold them loosely, which means I change my mind from time to time. And context is paramount, right? It all very much depends on the context. And I've been upsetting a lot of people online lately, primarily because they see certain of my opinions. I do believe in free markets and entrepreneurialism and personal liberty and individual striving and all of these things, which I express in my life and with my work. And I also believe in keeping the architectures of power flat and decentralized and things like that. These are all principles that drive my behavior, not just my beliefs. And then they take all of these things and assume that I'm with them on the entire bundle of other ideas that they've attached to that. And then I say Black Lives Matter, and their world is destroyed, and they are very upset that I've betrayed everything they held true. And I'm kind of a bit disgusted and skeezed out that they would ever think I was with them on that or other topics. So, it's confusing for all of us. It should be.
Right.
Yeah, it definitely seems like you've, having watched many of your talks over the years, it seems like you've become less anti-government over recent years, because I feel like you're, and maybe I was pegging you wrong, but it does seem like in most of your talks you emphasize the evils of government and the evils of centralization and the the harm caused by this top-down organization.
I'm very firmly anti-government still. I'm also anti-multinational corporation pretending to be government. But I do see a role for government, and I see the role for government in providing for some basic constitutional guarantees of freedom, and at the same time, I do see that as we operate today, in the system we operate today, there is a role for justice as a service, right? And that should be the service you get from government, and it should be very narrowly prescribed by constitutional principles and civil liberties. And I very strongly believe in those. So just because I'm anti-government doesn't mean I'm against a system of law, right? I'm not an anarchist. I think you need a system of law and some way of resolving disputes that precludes resolving them through violence. But that's, again, it's a nuanced conversation. It depends on the context.
Speaking of context, because I understand limited government, providing a legal framework, but in the context we're in now, in the pandemic, do you think that a decentralized solution would be better? Or do you think a centralized top-down approach is appropriate here?
I think a decentralized solution would be better if we had the social structures to encourage and operate within one, and we didn't when the pandemic hit. So whether I think it would have been better or not doesn't really matter. You go to pandemic with a society you have, not the society you wanted, right? Sure. We went into pandemic with a society that assumed from the get-go that the institutions in place would actually work, and was sitting there, the whole of most of the countries that I experienced, at least, where you had a lot of people waiting to hear what they should do next, because that's the framework they've been brought up in. And in that environment, if you then fail to have leadership and the institutions fail, you end up with the worst of both worlds. You end up in an environment where all of the regulations and weaknesses of a bureaucratic and sclerotic government work against you, but none of the leadership and opportunities for guidance work for you, and all of the people are expecting that, and then you get the worst of both worlds. So yes, sure, a decentralized solution would have been much better. And we did see that in some kind of narrow aspects of society. So if this pandemic had happened without the internet, without Twitter, without open channels for communication, for people in China to blow the whistle in the first place, and then for people to be able to bypass official channels that were not working and get a variety of sources of information and critically evaluate them, I wouldn't have been able to take the actions I took when I took them, which I feel protected me and worked for me. So I benefited from having access to decentralized platforms, in order to, the internet specifically, in order to act on my own when government wasn't acting.
That's kind of a topic too that we were kind of thinking about. So like you mentioned, like China, like there was some whistleblowers that released information about the virus and gave you the opportunity to act and stuff like that. And we know a lot of those whistleblowers were, arrested, and many of them have unfortunately passed away. And,
Mm-hmm.
That's only one of a string of egregious actions on the part of the Chinese Communist Party throughout this pandemic. Do you feel like that, like Western governments or even us as individuals, like our relationship to China should change because of this situation?
Well, it depends on what you see as our relationship to China. I think the relationship to the Chinese government should never have been anything other than contrarian to their dictatorship and totalitarian tendencies, and suspicious of their propaganda from the very beginning. So I found it kind of ironic that the conservative response to the pandemic was China lied to us, which seems stunning in a conservative party that created the slogan "Trust but Verify." It's like, so wait, you're telling me that you were fooled by a communist totalitarian government that lied to you, and you were surprised by this? That's not as strong an argument as you think it is. So I think that the response should have already been very, very different. When I was reading about what was happening in Wuhan in January, I was getting a lot of conflicting information, but there were a lot of Western leaders who were doing photo ops and smiling and saying, we're really glad that China's collaborating so nicely. Meanwhile, we're getting satellite photos of sulfur dioxide peaking over Wuhan because the crematoria are running 24/7. And they're like, yeah, we have 4,000 dead. Bullshit. And anybody who was paying attention knew that was a lie from the very, very beginning. And we'll never know how big of a lie it was, because anybody who tries to tell the truth is disappeared instantly by that government. Our relationship with China should be very different, but that relationship shouldn't be different in terms of trying to push for war or punishing the Chinese population who had nothing to do with this, right? It should be about trying to create more opportunities for freedom and communication and connection with Chinese people, bypassing their government. We should be dropping Tor nodes, not bombs, on that country.
As many as
Raspberry
possible.
Pis with Tor nodes on them.
I like it.
And shortwave radios.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask what you also kind of spinning off the comment that you made about how well, it's good that we had these decentralized channels to get information from. Do you have any specific like channels or maybe methods for discerning the noise, the signal from all of the noise, basically for making sense of everything, basically in an information environment where you can't really trust any one person?
No, I think I'm in the same boat as everybody else, which is that it takes an enormous amount of work to apply the filtering and critical thinking, and even when you do all of that work, you end up being subject to your own cognitive biases and desires that obscure the truth. I think that's one of the big problems, which is that we're in a completely new information environment, and none of us have the necessary experience to handle this environment. So we're all learning all of these critical thinking skills. The world was a lot simpler when you simply had a trusted authoritative source, and whatever they said was the truth, or so you thought. Right. It was a lot simpler to just believe, CBS or whatever the TV station was. That was
Dan Rather.
Or Dan Rather. Or the
Yeah,
New
my
York
parents were
Times,
like, come on, Dan Rather always told us the truth.
Well, yes. And again, that was probably a very nice position of privilege to be in, because that was one truth, and it was very, very explicitly biased in particular directions. We're now operating in a wide open information environment, and this is going to take a whole new generation of people who learn how to manage that environment, and we don't have the tools yet. So I'm hoping we'll get them and build them and use them better.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I just sort of still feel confused about, or a bit that's been sort of going around in my mind, is like when I look at the information environment as I see it, I really do see a lot of radical leftist ideas, like really taking the population by storm, like getting a lot of popularity, gaining traction in the mainstream media for what that institution still has clout. And people are really willing to act on it, to really put their bodies out there for these ideas. And so I guess I don't totally understand why someone like you, or who is opposed to like a radical, or isn't in support of a radical leftist ideology, wouldn't be more concerned about the spread of those, about what's happening with those ideas.
Because mostly I see these as, I see both of the radical wings, both the radical leftist and the neo-Nazi alt-right and fascist wings, the fringes of the political ideology in this country, as forces that come out of impotence and fear. And I don't see them having much of an effect on mainstream society. I think they're still fringe ideologies. I've been more concerned about authoritarian movements from the right, primarily because they do have the not so tacit, very explicit support and funding and power of the federal government, of giant police, law enforcement, and military agencies, which tend to have authoritarian tendencies that are on the right side of the spectrum. And I'm more concerned about those simply because they have actual power and resources. In terms of narratives, though, the dueling narratives of the fringes, they don't particularly concern me. I don't expect to see the U.S. descending into socialism anytime soon. I don't think the system is at risk of that.
I mean, it's kind of
but when the president is talking about invoking the Insurrection Act, when they're talking about using troops to quell protests, when extreme militarized force is being used against some violent protesters, but mostly peaceful protesters with immensely disproportionate force, I'm much more concerned about a Kent State-style massacre happening. And I'm much more concerned about the suppression of political dissent across the board of any ideology. being happily endorsed by government forces. So that worries me much more than whether, Seattle has an autonomous zone.
I don't know,
Honestly.
man. I mean, to me, it looks like Iran in 1979. Like, if leading up to that, the government let out a bunch of political prisoners that were leftist, and then the leftist movement gained like a ton of traction, support, very similar ideology to the current leftist movement in the U.S. They took down the government, and then the right swung in and for the radical right government. Like, it seems like it's a bad or a dangerous feedback loop.
Yes, absolutely, because when radicalism is the only expression that is available to people, when peaceful reform isn't available, what you end up doing is you start ping-ponging, as you rightly pointed out about Iran. You start basically going from one extreme to the other in a series of ever-escalating backlash movements. And I think there is a risk of that. But I don't think that is a leftist problem or a far rightist problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that it usually goes is
that's a radicalization problem.
Yeah, like, so either a lot of times, so I think whenever these sort of social unrest situations happen, it can go one of two directions. It seems like either the leftists succeed in taking down the government and installing themselves in power, and then you get things like Russia or Cambodia or various places where China, where basically they just killed off the ruling class, and usually that doesn't go very well after. And then you have the situation where there's a backlash from the right that's strong enough that it probably causes a lot of violence, and like stability is held basically, but then you have military dictatorship or something like that. So it seems like if stuff gets bad enough, then we could be looking at one of those scenarios. Hopefully, as you've indicated, stuff won't get that bad.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with your prior experience and perspective. One of the things that might give you the perspective as to why my fears tend to be more in one direction rather than the other, as yours, Ariel, is that I grew up in the post-dictatorship environment in Greece, where the country was ruled by fascists, where there was a bitter civil war between the communists and the fascists, where the CIA intervened, established a military dictatorship, and that left a stain on the political institutions that lasted through the first decade and a half of my childhood. And, I was brutalized by cops in Greece and then again in the US. And I got to see fascism firsthand. And it was just as deadly, right? There were quite a lot of, I think the Greek fascist regime after the Civil War killed about 500,000 communists, but which in Greek population numbers is pretty high. So, the issue is radicalism, right? And then depending on maybe what your background and experience is, you might fear or more clearly see the signs of one form of radicalism versus the other. And you may be more blind to the other form of radicalism that wasn't so prominent in your particular experience. Maybe it's something like that.
Yeah, that definitely hits home.
Yeah. So
yeah.
I'm much more allergic, if you like, or sensitive to right-wing authoritarianism because I've lived through it and seen it firsthand. I know plenty of people who are the exact opposite.
Another possible difference in context too, one thing you brought up earlier is that people forget 1968. And as soon as you said that, I was like, well, yeah, I'm not really aware what 1968 was like. And I don't think that many millennials, I don't think many of us have that in our cultural memory.
Right. troops in the streets, martial law, more than 300 domestic terror attacks in a period of 3 years, and the assassination of about a dozen political leaders in the civil rights movement. So imagine all of what's happening now, only martial law, bombs going off every week in different American cities, and Bernie Sanders gets assassinated, and then a whole bunch of others get assassinated. That's what was happening in 1968. And the Americans have forgotten. So as much as people are like, oh my God, things are out of control now, in terms of recent American political history, they're not. And hopefully they won't be.
Yeah, I hope you're right.
So far it's been relatively peaceful. So the violence is fairly isolated and sporadic. You're not getting the all-out violence. And, that's another area where I have a very different experience, because growing up in the Balkans, in the early 90s, I got to see what was happening next door in Yugoslavia. And so talk about like a sudden deterioration of civil society into all-out sectarian warfare. These are things that are alien to American culture. And let's hope that they remain alien, because that is essentially a complete system failure.
So I was, just to kind of turn things away from the sort of the dark apocalyptic stuff. So I was curious. So you've written some books. I think you're still working on the Lightning Network book. That hasn't come out yet, right?
No, it's actually quite delayed.
Okay.
Some things happened.
Okay. All right.
2020 didn't go as planned.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Really?
So 2020 has been canceled. We'll see you all back in 2021.
Yeah.
So I did want to ask you just so you're the kind of person who was always working on something. I'm curious, like what projects have your attention right now? What's your new obsession?
Well, I'm working on a number of educational activities, building some new content that I'm going to be launching in the next couple of months, as well as working on the book. So the book hasn't been delivered, but it's been making slow progress, but it has been making progress. So 4 or 5 chapters are drafted to various extent. And all of that's happening live on GitHub. So if you want to check it out, github.com/lnbook, Lightning Network book, is where you can find it. And you can actually watch us writing every day a bit. And there's things you can play with. So I'm continuing to do that. I've increased the rate at which I'm doing live stream content. So previously I did once a month, I did a monthly live stream Q&A for my Patreon subscribers. That's now open to the public, and I'm now doing a live stream or video premiere every Saturday. So weekly events, and doing a lot more Q&A sessions, and they're open to a bigger audience since, everybody's stuck at home with not much to do, including myself.
Cool. Are you still as excited about the potential of the Lightning Network?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And the stuff that's happening in Lightning is exciting, and it continues to evolve, and the level of innovation is continuing to accelerate. Things are getting easier and easier to use. So yeah, I'm absolutely just as excited as I've ever been in the Lightning Network.
Cool. Yeah, and for our audience members who don't know, the Lightning Network is a decentralized payment network built on top of Bitcoin, which is a decentralized currency. Yeah, I'm also pretty hopeful about it.
We might need it coming up soon here.
Yeah. So continuing to work on other decentralized projects. All of my work continues to be open source, and so it can be accessed online for free. There's a lot of we're doing a lot of work with volunteer translators in various languages to translate various books that I've published. My Mastering Ethereum book turned open source in January. The license switched from a non-commercial, non-derivative to a Creative Commons share alike, so absolutely open. And that then made it possible for a number of volunteers to start translating it. They're currently translating it into, I think, 27 languages. And that's all happening in the public sphere. And I'm continuing to work on all of those projects, which all have a common theme, which is teach as many people as possible in as many languages as possible about these technologies, Bitcoin and open blockchains, decentralized technologies.
Cool. Yeah, no, I've definitely been inspired by your commitment to teaching as many people as possible and sharing your knowledge with the world. I do think that decentralized education like that is sort of a necessary thing that we need to develop as a society to get us over the next hump.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a lot of fun. Honestly, I can't imagine doing a job that would be more fun than the one I'm doing right now. So I'm incredibly lucky to be able to do what I really, really enjoy.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, Andreas. We really appreciate you coming and giving us a long chat about, I don't know, just your views on what's happening now.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, this has been super interesting.
Yeah,
always,
it's been a pleasure, and I really, really enjoy our conversations and back and forth. And again, thank you for making the time to do this.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I definitely always enjoy talking to you, Andreas. So thanks, audience.
Thank you for watching. And if you like this, please like, subscribe, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think, especially if you disagree. And we'll see you next time.
Smash the like.
And be sure to check out Andreas's video on streaming money if you want to understand the Lightning Network more.
Yeah, we'll link it in the description.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for joining us on the Multiversity Project. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversityproject.co.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.